This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for April 20th, 2020. Truth might be stranger than fiction, but my guest in this podcast writes both, and we'll be hearing how they can intermingle in the murky world of DC politics.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast. That's coming up shortly, but first I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I appreciate them all. Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. And if you think that you could do the same, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. If you're looking for reading suggestions to fill up the lockdown hours, I'd suggest anything by Dave Eggers. He's a great and inventive writer. He started out with a huge hit about 20 years ago called A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. That was the actual title, in case you aren't familiar with it, and it suits the book. It was a memoir, an autobiography basically, and he wrote it while he was still in his 20s, which is a bit unusual. Mostly it's at the end of people's careers that they write memoirs, but if you read the book, you'll see it was worth it. He's written other works since, and one I'm reminded of is called What is the What? It's a true story of a guy called Valentino Achak Deng. Valentino comes from Sudan, and he eventually settled in the United States, but that was after some truly amazing and often horrifying ordeals in his childhood. Most of the people in his village were murdered. He went on epic treks as an unaccompanied child across several countries in East Africa, from one refugee camp to another, and he was very lucky to survive hunger, war, disease, and every other biblical misfortune. Many of the people he encountered did not survive. He didn't know it at the time. He was a child caught up in a civil war, but the author of much of his misfortune was a man called Omar al-Bashir. He was the president of Sudan and started a civil war to get access to the oil under the lands where Valentino and his family lived. That's hugely simplified. Sudan suffered a decades-long and very complex conflict based on resources, ethnic and religious differences, and outside interference. But al-Bashir is undoubtedly someone who has the blood of thousands on his hands. He was overthrown a year ago following intense protests from his own population against poverty and bad government. There are elections scheduled for 2022. I don't know if they'll make things much better. Sudan is miserably poor, but they can hardly make them any worse. I thought of that book when I saw a headline recently that al-Bashir is likely to be extradited to The Hague to face war crimes charges by the interim government in Sudan. That's a pretty new thing to happen. It's not the first time it's happened. Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Serbia during the war in ex-Yugoslavia, was extradited in 2002. But historically, dictators have rarely been brought to justice, except some sort of victor's justice if they are overthrown. They tend to get shot by their successors. Both ex-Yugoslavia and Sudan were particularly cruel wars for civilian non-combatants. That's the legal reasoning behind putting those dictators on trial, but in researching that, I came across a startling fact. The lethality of some wars for the civilian population in recent years is appalling. Syria stands out as by far the worst, with 24 civilians per 100,000 killed in 2019 alone. After that, wars in South Sudan, where Valentino is from, Burkina Faso in West Africa, the Central African Republic and Somalia all had civilian death rates between 6 and 9 per 100,000 in 2019 alone. Bear in mind that's just for 1 year. The people killed stay dead, so those figures are cumulative for however long the wars go on. Those figures are terrible, obviously, but what's really striking is that mixed in with those African countries with wars with high civilian death rates are El Salvador, Honduras and Mexico, who all have similar civilian death rates, not from real wars, but from gang wars. In fact, El Salvador has a total murder rate higher than the civilian death rate in all war zones, by a huge margin, more than 60 per 100,000, compared to 24 per 100,000 civilian war deaths in Syria, though obviously there are likely to be other murders in Syria not accounted for there. The United States has a long history of intervening in Latin America, usually with the stated aim of stopping communism. It seems like crime is a much bigger threat to many of the people there than war, and if wars with lower civilian death rates justify UN peace talks, war crimes trials at The Hague, and other diplomatic efforts, it would surely be in the interests of the United States and all Western countries to put some resources into helping those countries fight crime.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line, I have Tom Rosenstiel. Tom founded and for 16 years directed the Project for Excellence in Journalism. He was also a reporter and editor, during which time he wrote about politics, culture, technology and the media. And he's currently executive director of the American Press Institute, a think tank making news sustainable, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Tom, I know that on top of all of that, you've been writing a series of novels, and the most recent one, Oppo, came out late last year. Tell me what the novels are about.
The novels are political thrillers, and they're very realistic. I don't blow up the Capitol or the Pentagon or the Vatican or anything like that. They don't have secret assassins in them. They're really social realism in the style of really books like Advise and Consent or Failsafe from the 1960s. And the protagonists of my book are political consultants, fixers, in Washington who people in power go to when they have a problem. And the premise of Oppo, which is based on a real case, is someone is approached about the vice presidency, actually in the book, by someone in each party. And the next day she's threatened that if she accepts the offer of the vice presidency, an unnamed antagonist has something on her that they would use to destroy her. She seeks out these two consultants who are named Peter Reyna and Randy Brooks and asks them if they can find out who it is that is threatening her and what it is they might have. And this is based on an actual incident when Barack Obama approached a Republican about replacing Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court.
I should say, for the uninitiated, Oppo is short for opposition. That means opposition research, which is a term in politics, particularly within the Beltway in Washington, whereby you research your opposition and try and find as much dirt as possible on them. You say it's based on a real incident. How true is the dirt?
Well, the actual person in real life, who I cannot divulge who this is, swears to this day that they don't know what it was. They just didn't really want to take the risk.
They would say that, wouldn't they, perhaps? But just to broaden that out a little bit, you've got this story, most recently, Oppo, about a campaign for the presidency. Before that, you have other ones, I think, about a Supreme Court nomination battle. And obviously you were a journalist, so you're basing this on your journalistic history. Isn't this maybe a little bit gilding it? That isn't politics an awful lot more mundane than that, and people aren't nearly as smart as that they just sort of, they're human beings who are blundering along?
Yes, there's a lot of blundering along, as we know from real life. Uh, what's fascinating to me about politics is that people come to Washington, at least, with the best of intentions. I mean, this is not a place where you necessarily go initially to get rich. People come to change the world and make it better, at least as they see it. And we have arrived at a place in the United States where, with the best of intentions, they have created a system that doesn't work. The government in the United States is broken. And so a lot of the stories are really trying to figure out, how did we get to this paradox where people come to make things better and they make them worse? What's the interlocking dysfunction that happens here? And I think fiction is a way of telling this, because in fiction you can be in the hearts of your characters. When I was a very young journalist, someone said to me, beware of the fallacy of evil people. People don't usually do something like Snidely Whiplash because they want to be evil. They have good reasons, at least in their mind, rationalizations. Unless they're actually a serial killer or some kind of psychopath, they do things thinking that this will be, that they can justify this. We get into means versus ends problems. But whether it's a Supreme Court nomination where the only way you can really hurt yourself is by answering a question honestly, or a terrorist incident where people want to seize on tragedy for their political purposes, or a campaign, exploring how good people do bad things, I think, is kind of the core of the story.
I'm struck by how sometimes people, particularly in their enemies, see a huge amount of planning and forethought and scheming that I suspect sometimes might just not exist. And I think particularly of the way that Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz were once talking about Donald Trump and how they do it now. And if they had been planning to do what they're doing all along, they surely wouldn't have said what they said originally about Donald Trump. Do you think that people overestimate the ability of their enemies?
Yes, I do. In fact, I think in the book I'm working on now, which is a fourth book in the series, one of the things that I talk about is how the story involves someone who comes from business and into politics, a billionaire who becomes very successful in politics, and he's amazed that people in politics spend so little time on execution. They fall in love with their own rhetoric and their good intentions, and they spend very little time on how you would actually accomplish something, which in business, it's just the opposite. I mean, you really don't imagine your rhetoric until the very end when you're into marketing. And it's not about belief. You're trying to create a product. The product has to work. And he's just mystified by what he considers the delusional aspects of people who are in the political world.
Yeah, surely not based on reality at all. But just to move on just a little bit, I know that before you started writing novels, you did write one book that I'm particularly interested in. It was from about 10 years ago. It's called Blur: How to Know What's True in the Age of Information Overload. So first of all, you win the prize for getting the title of the book that became ever more relevant as the years have gone by. But answer the question in the title: how do we know what's true in an age of information overload?
So the concept behind that book was that we were moving to a world in which information was controlled on the demand side. By that I mean the audience was going to be in charge of the information that it consumed, rather than the intermediaries, the gatekeepers. That metaphor of a gatekeeper, which comes from the 20th century and refers to news people, journalists.
People like you.
Right. People like me who entered the business in 1980, feels like 1880. That term gatekeeper implied that it was a metaphor, and it implied that you were standing by a gate and you determined what the public should know, what the public would know. And in that old conception of journalism, you didn't let rumors and gossip through the gate. And by 2010 or so, gatekeepers, the press as a gatekeeper was standing next to a gate, but there was no fence on either side. And who controlled information, and this is really before social media, was the consumer. So the only thing that would drive good information was the demand side. If consumers, if the public knew how to discern what good information was versus bad. And so the concept in Blur was, how do we teach the things that journalists used to think about and know inside newsrooms and convey that to the public so that they could make discerning choices about the information that they were consuming. And that's obviously a problem that we confront even more today when bad actors are manipulating that information to sow confusion.
You've anticipated the question I was arriving at there. You're saying the bad actors are manipulating that. Doesn't that kind of undermine the presumption that you just said a minute ago that it is being demand-led?
Well, no, it is being demand-led, but the demand is not actually for good information. The demand appears to be for information that helps people make the world make sense according to their preconceptions or their world beliefs.
Yes, so hold with that, Tom. Hold with that, Tom.
Yeah.
So is the demand, is that when people make that demand, that's individual, you and me people making that demand, is there perhaps a split personality whereby what we want or what we do that triggers that demand is not what we might say that we want? And in a sense that the algorithms are watching our behavior, and what we might say at a dinner table that we want to, the high-minded stuff that we're interested in reading might not be as true, and the algorithms are detecting that.
Yes, I think it's complex in the sense that the research suggests that nobody wants to be fooled. No one who makes these decisions about I believe this and I don't believe that thinks that they are, wants to be misled, wants to be deceived, So if you, the way that they rationalize hearing about something that they don't like is to call it a hoax, to say that thing is a deception, and I won't be deceived. Donald Trump and other populist leaders obviously play into that. They use the word hoax a lot. And there's this dialectic here between whether people make choices about anything, about any kind of new information in their lives, based on in a rational way that we thought of, that we like to think of with enlightenment, what that rationality and reason would guide my choices, or whether they do it according to a more complex equation, which is, I understand how the world works. I've lived my life. I've experienced a lot of things. And I pick and choose information that makes sense according to that belief system that I have, which is more subtle than preconceptions and bias. It's a kind of rationality.
I'm reminded of the story of People magazine. And People magazine started in about 1974. And it was set up by Time, as in the Time magazine. And what they noticed was that the People page, which was one page in Time magazine, which was a little bit celebrity, a little bit gossip columny, was the most popular page in Time magazine. But isn't there sort of a problem there that at the time when we all got our news on the newsstands, that people might have liked to read the People page in Time magazine, but they like to walk down the street or go into work or whatever with Time magazine under their arm rather than People magazine. And now that, you could almost call it social enforcement, is just gone out the window. Can we ever get anything to get that back, to get people almost to be their best selves?
Yes, I think we can, but it's not a permanent state. I mean, we don't always stay our best selves. You think of a moment like the Civil War in the United States. Abraham Lincoln appealed to people being their better selves. He talked about the better angels of our nature. Franklin Roosevelt during World War II appealed to people to be their better selves. When he talked about we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and then 2 weeks later on his first fireside chat told people, don't take your money out of banks. The whole system needs you to trust the banks. And in fact, put your money back in banks. And they did. So it required in those two instances a leader who rallied people to become their better selves. That doesn't always happen, and it takes extraordinary moments for that to happen. And people then, I think, go back to being their more selfish selves. But yes, it can happen. But it's not a permanent state of condition, I think.
How do you improve that?
Well, you give people tools. There's a term, we don't use it in the book Blur very much, but there's a term called news literacy, which is how skillful are you at consuming information that you need to navigate your life. I am not fond of the term news literacy because literacy suggests is very binary. You can read or you can't read. And if you can't read, you get nothing out of a book. The term that I think is more apt here would be fluency. We can all speak a little bit. I know a few words of German. I know more words of Spanish, but I'm hardly fluent. You can get better. And when you get better, you can navigate better. You are able to know more and get around and be more empowered. And I think that notion of how to empower yourself in a way that gives you more freedom is a way that you can give people more skills, and that's really what
and how do we do that?
To do in Burr. Well, so one of the ways you can do it is if we build our journalism a little differently. And right now, if you read a typical story in the news, in the middle of the story, it might tell you things about how the story was done, why the story was done, how many sources the story had reached out to, and why those sources were reliable. But you can begin to, and those are news literacy questions or news fluency questions, but you can put those on top of a story. The New York Times now does this a lot in their, if you open a story, the first thing you see is not the lead of the story, but key points about the story, including important takeaways or why the Times did the story in the first place. These are essentially news fluency questions that are being billboarded up top. And the more that you can do that, the more you're training people to be discerning. The more they consume, the more discerning they become.
And aren't you sort of in a bind there that, yeah, that's the right thing to do, but it's just way more attractive to click on the stuff that riles you up?
Yes, it does. And this is actually a problem in social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter. They talk about meaningful engagement. Their metrics of meaningful engagement is sharing and liking. And what we know... And
sharing is stronger than liking, yeah.
And sharing is stronger than liking. And what we know from all kinds of research is that is not a representative sample of how people feel about things. There's a kind of bipolar quality to those metrics in the sense that the things we share and like are the things that make us very happy or very angry. We don't share something where we say, I didn't know about that. That's interesting. I don't know what to think about that. I'll look for more stories passively as they come along and see if I can learn a little more. Now that metric, which is unmeasurable in Facebook, is probably the metric that conceptually would be most important to an old-fashioned journalist. A story where people say, that's interesting. If another one of those comes along, I might read it. As opposed to tell people something they already know and that just riles them up. Yeah, that gets engagement, but journalists, in the end, were never entirely satisfied by those stories that they knew weren't really fundamentally telling somebody something new. But in our social media landscape, the things that we are served up more often, the things that they monetize, the things that they care about, are the things that make people extremely happy or extremely angry, and it essentially squeezes out the middle.
And I'm going to put you in the seat of being a multi-billionaire. Let's say you were the next Mark Zuckerberg, and you could design the news system and news delivery system that you thought would serve what you wanted to do. What features would that have?
Well, one thing it would have is it would create a definition of community that was geographically located. In other words, where you lived, I would serve people content about that, so that they would be more aware of their civic life. Another thing I would do is I would block things that I knew were untrue, which the platforms seem unwilling to do.
Are they able?
Yes, they are able. But there are two things that get in the way of their wanting to do that. One is false information is profitable because it riles people up. And the other is that the more that they become active editors or gatekeepers of what's on the platform, the more they could be, at least in theory, open to being responsible and thus open to litigation. If they make a case about the open web and we want an open web, which relieves them of responsibility. The third thing I would do in my new landscape is I would surface stories that a team of editors thought were valuable for people to know, whether they clicked, whether they shared them or liked them or not. So some percentage of what would be in the stream would be what you might call public square information that was simply valuable for the public square to see, which would, by the way, also be a way of exposing people to information that they didn't necessarily agree with or knew nothing about or had no track record of saying, oh yes, that will get a share and a like.
Tom Rosenstiel, veteran journalist, novelist, and promoter of excellence in journalism, thank you very much for talking to me.
It's been a pleasure, William. Thank you.
Never miss a show. You can subscribe to the podcast for free using iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast software or app. See challengingopinions.com/subscribe for details.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow Tom Rosenstiel @Tom Rosenstiel, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks to everyone who signed up as a patron on Patreon so far. I really appreciate them helping me to devote more time to researching topics and guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate a buck or two per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/challengingopinions, or you'll find the link on the website. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. Coming up next Monday, that's April 27th, I'll be talking to the business executive and foreign policy expert Stephen Coltai about how business can bring peace to the world. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.